We're now going to look at some key figures in the 20th century. We're going to look at some psychologists, and then we're going to look at some ethologists. So let's start out with psychologists. Xing-Yang Kuo is, in my mind, one of the most important people in the history of science, or the modern history of science. He was a radical behaviorist, and people tended to not particularly like him because of that. But in addition to that, and I think more importantly, he had a lot to say about how behavior develops. And in fact, he did a lot of research himself on behavioral embryology, published a whole series of papers in zoology journals in the 1920s. He also had a couple theories. One is the theory of behavioral gradients. And basically, what this theory indicates is that every part of an organism is involved in any given behavior at every point in time. It's just that some parts are more involved than others. And to drive that home, I'm showing a picture of myself back in the 1980s on Mount Washington. I broke my toe the day before we decided to go to Mount Washington. And the weather was beautiful. I probably shouldn't have gone, but I did, because it was my little toe. You know, I figured, well, who needs a little toe? I can certainly hike up Mount Washington with a broken little toe. And actually, I did. I mean, walking up was actually pretty painless. Walking down was another story altogether. I made it, thank goodness, but I realized at that point how much one uses one's little toe in things that you would never even think are important. And it kind of goes back to what Kuo was saying in his theory of behavioral gradients. Every part of the body is involved in any given behavior. It's just that some are more involved than others, depending on what that behavior happens to be, thus the theory of behavioral gradients. He also had a theory of behavioral potentials, and a cornerstone of this theory is a term that he gave us called behavioral neophenotypes. These are potential behaviors that we are capable of exhibiting, but that, as of the current time, are not part of the species' typical repertoire. But he went on to say that, you know what, conditions could change, there could be ecological changes, whatever, that might actually force these potential behaviors to occur more frequently, so an organism could adapt to these changes, and then those behaviors could potentially become incorporated into the species' typical repertoire, because you would then start to see them occur more regularly. So behavioral neophenotypes. And he did some experiments to actually show this. In fact, one thing that he did is shown in this picture right here, and this is one of his photographs, where he reared a cat and a rat together from an early age. Now, cats and rats typically are not buddies, and but you know, by having reared them together, they shared the same milk bowl. I mean, they were fine with one another. Here's some videos that I found. Now, this is obviously is not from Kuo, but again, it shows you that yes, things that typically would not occur can occur if the developmental history of the organism is such that you can actually have these things happen. Behavioral neophenotypes, typical behaviors. And the cat is even grooming the rat. Like, oh my gosh, the dog doesn't know what's going on. Dog is just dumbfounded by this whole thing. And just a couple more photographs to show with some other individuals that yes, this is possible. Now the rat is grooming the cat. Different cat. And now they're just having a great time. Behavioral neophenotypes. So Kuo was an important figure in development and a big proponent of behavioral epigenesis in a book that he wrote in 1967. And According to Kuo's theory of behavioral epigenesis, or his viewpoint, this part was not really a theory, he said that there are 5 factors that affect any given behavior that an organism engages in. One is morphology or anatomy. In other words, obviously, there will be constraints based upon our morphological makeup in terms of any given behavior we're capable of doing and the manner in which we are doing it. Also, biophysical and biochemical factors. So, these would include things like neurotransmitters, hormones, things like that. The developmental history of the organism, and I think the behavioral neophenotype examples attest to the importance of that. And again, he was a strong advocate of the importance of behavioral development in particular. Stimulating objects, and by that he meant things that were in the immediate environment of the organism that would affect the way that any given behavior might occur. And the environmental context, something that has been vastly underplayed, but we now know that this is an incredibly important factor in terms of the way in which organisms behave. The environmental context, the physical setting in which the organism finds itself when it's engaging in any particular behavior. Okay, next up is T.C. Schneerle. And he was a leading figure in comparative psychology. His own work involved army ants. He went to Panama almost every year to study army ants in the field, as we'll see in a moment. And his actual work was at the American Museum of Natural History, and he also had a faculty position at Hunter College in New York City. And that's one of his books that he wrote. This one deals exclusively with army ants. So here's a video that shows us a little bit more about T.C. Schneerle.
Dr. T.C. Schneerle came from the American Museum of Natural History in New York. He started his explorations of army ants about 75 years ago in 1932. Dr. Schneerle, however, was an energetic field scientist who was unafraid of the forest at night, and he became the first person to follow army ants during their nightly emigrations. In fact, he followed the same colony every night for over 6 weeks. He made many discoveries, and perhaps the most important is shown in this chart. On the left, you see the nomadic phase, when the colony emigrates about 100 meters every night for about 2 weeks. During the nomadic phase, the colony has an immense brood of over 100,000 larvae. That phase ends when the larvae complete their development and spin cocoons. When the brood is all in cocoons, the colony stops emigrating, and that time Dr. Schneerle called the statory phase. The statory phase lasts about 3 weeks. At the bottom of the chart, the slender queen becomes pregnant during the middle of the statory phase and lays the next brood of 100,000 eggs. Just as young worker ants are emerging from their cocoons, the next brood is hatching from eggs, and the colony starts the next nomadic phase. These alternating nomadic and statory phases have gone on continuously for millions of years. Imagine you have up to 700,000 siblings with whom you share a house. Not a large home, not a place where you have your own space, but you live in close quarters, very close quarters. So close you're constantly climbing over one another. Your mother just laid 100,000 eggs, one after the other, one by one. Your father left his sperm more than a year ago and then died. Moreover, your mother will lay 100,000 eggs every 35 days for her entire life. She doesn't care for them. You have to feed and care for the babies 24 hours of every day. Moreover, you have to move all those babies every night for 2 weeks or you will run out of nearby food. Lucky for you, the babies grow up in 2 weeks and then take a 3-week break when they do not eat at all. After that, they will help, like you, with the work of the colony for the rest of their lives. Imagine further that you're blind, only about half an inch long, and required to go out every morning and search for any small living animal that you can kill. You do not do this alone, but in a swarm, like a pack of 50,000 miniature wolves. Since you are blind, you find your prey by taste, by smell, and by touch, using sense organs that are so phenomenally sensitive that we humans are only beginning to understand how you do it.
Wow, life as an army ant is pretty tough. T.C. Schnerle had a student, Daniel S. Lehrman, who was a leading figure in comparative psychology, following right in the footsteps of T.C. Schnerle. He wrote a very famous critique of Konrad Lorenz's theory of instinctive behavior that was published not in a psychology journal, but in a prestigious biology journal, the Quarterly Review of Biology. And he did this while he was a graduate student. Very, very unusual for somebody to do that, especially with a journal that prominent and with as important a paper as this turned out to be. Himself, he actually worked on ringdoves. He studied the internal, by which I mean hormonal, environment of ringdoves, and how that affects the external environment of ringdoves. For example, how hormones in, say, a male will trigger certain behaviors to occur, courtship behaviors. So all of that would be sort of like internal to the bird. But then a female who is observing that behavior and hearing the calls that the male is doing, well, the female is external to the male, so that's part of the external environment, how that will now cause hormones to be secreted in her, which then in turn affects her behavior, and then that feeds back and affects the male's behavior in a different way, how other environmental factors affect hormonal secretion, like springtime conditions. We'll be looking at that in a later segment, but that's pretty much what he spent his career studying in the laboratory. Okay, now let's move on and look at some ethologists from the 20th century. Douglas Spalding did the very first studies on imprinting, the development of social attachments, and part of that was working on critical periods for the development of these social attachments in the context of imprinting. So, you take a newly hatched chick and you expose it to something to see if they'll imprint to it, but you expose different chicks at different times. And what this graph is showing us is that between about 9 to 12 weeks and up to around 20 weeks, we have a greater level of imprinting occurring. And so Spalding called that a critical period. Now, I'm not a fan of the term critical period because it makes it sound like if it doesn't happen within that period of time, it won't happen at all. But you can see from this graph that, yes, it will happen. It may not be as potent as during the critical period, but it does happen outside the critical period as well. Now, if you wait till the animal is too old, then it's not going to form an attachment to a parental object because now it's not really all that young. So basically, yes, there are times in the life of an individual where there is going to be sort of an optimal time for these kinds of behaviors to occur, attachment formation, for example. But critical, maybe not so critical. And in fact, many people don't even use the term critical period anymore, though you will see it. But I think a more sensible term is sensitive period or optimal period. In other words, times when a behavior is more likely to occur with least amount of effort as opposed to other times.
Human bird. After 10 years of experimenting, he attempts his first flight. Up on the rock. Are you ready? Go!
Not very good flying. Well, that's something else he studied. Not exactly the movie I showed you. He was looking at the maturation, as he called it, of instinctive behaviors. He wanted to see what would happen, for example, if you reared swallows in a small cage, a bird cage, and then see what happens when they're released. Can they fly or can't they fly? So he actually did that. So he took some swallows and he put the swallows one by one in bird cages. And then he said that they didn't really require practice when they were released because they flew. And unfortunately, that is the part of his research that a lot of the genetic determinists, mostly in the ethological literature, have actually latched onto. They said, oh, look, it's all instinctive. They didn't need to practice it. Well, the part that they neglected to cite, that most people neglected to cite, is that, okay, they flew, but they did not fly well when they were released. They could fly, but, sort of like going back to that film clip that I just showed. But, they did not fly very well, and I'm just trying to do the best I can with this crude animation to show that they didn't fly all that well. So, basically, there's a strong opportunity here for nonlinear experiences to contribute to the fact that they flew at all. But nobody was looking at this back in the 1800s. And in fact, people didn't really start looking at this until around 1970s, not in the context of flight, but in the context of species identification. But in any event, think about it. Although the bird can't practice flying while in this cage, it can certainly engage in muscle movements in the wings to keep the muscle tone up in the wings, muscles that are involved in flight, and contribute to the development of flying. That's what I mean by nonlinear. In other words, you don't have to practice flying to fly. But there are certain nonlinear types of experiences, subtle muscle movements, for example, flapping of the wings, for example, that can play a role in the development of the ability to fly. And then once you are given the ability to fly, having been reared in a cage like this, then practice of flying will kick in, and hopefully you'll fly better than you were when you were first released from the cage. And the practice of flying would be a linear experience because practicing flying helps you fly better. So a nonlinear experience would be whatever is occurring inside the cage that contributes to your ability to get off the ground at all. Another person is von Uexküll, a German investigator who gave us a concept called Umwelt, which translates as perceptual world. In other words, what he meant by that is the same physical environment is perceived differently by different species, has different functional significance for different species. And this was kind of neat because it's a very non-anthropocentric point of view. It's actually taking context into account with respect to every given species and not trying to impose the way we see the world on other species in terms of the way, we assume that they see the world the same way we do, and that the objects that we have find functionally important, of course, would be functionally important to other species, when in fact that's hardly the case. And so, to make his point, in a book chapter, a very long book chapter he wrote that deals with this, he drew some figures. And here's the first one. Oh, well, I added that animated figure. This is a room, okay? We're going to be looking at 3 figures of the same room, and the things that are colored are things that would have immediate functional significance to 3 different species. And the reason I put a human on that sofa is this is the way a human would see the room. In other words, we walk into this room, everything that's colored is something that we could immediately relate to. We can relate to the bookcase, we can relate to the desk, the tables, the chairs, the sofa, the chair. All of that has immediate functional significance. This is a human Umwelt, a human perceptual world for this particular space. Now take the same physical space, but how would a dog view it? Well, the sofa, the chair, the dining room chairs and plates and glasses may have some functional significance to a dog, especially if the dog's been fed off of plates and things like that. But a desk, a dog can't relate to a desk or a bookcase or anything like that. Now finally, what about a fly? The only things the fly might relate to are perhaps the light that's shining down on the table, the plates, the glasses, if there's food residue on any of these things, but certainly nothing else. They would not be part of a fly's Umwelt. And it makes sense, especially when you even look at the way eyes are constructed in non-human organisms, especially something like an insect, or a honeybee or a fly. Their visual systems are so incredibly different from ours that, of course, they're not going to perceive the world the way we do. This is how I might look to an insect with a compound eye, like a bee. Kind of creepy. Very creepy from a human standpoint, but certainly not to an insect. Okay, three co-winners of the Nobel Prize in 1973, three ethologists. Interestingly, of course, there's no category for ethology, so they were awarded the Nobel Prize under the category of experimental medicine, physiology or medicine. And those three ethologists are Karl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nicholas Tinbergen. And we've already heard about Tinbergen and even Lorenz a little bit. So here's Lorenz once again, and he's best known for his studies of imprinting. In fact, he coined the German term for imprinting, Prägung, which is a stamping in other words, an imprint. He gave us a theory of instinctive behavior that we'll look at in a different segment. And he also had a lot to say about the domestication of animals, and actually nothing really good to say about it, and we'll look at that in a later segment. Most of his own work is based on very casual, unplanned observations, very simple experiments, certainly crude by modern standards, on the important stimuli, things that he thought were key stimuli that elicit what he called innate behaviors. He bought heavily into the concept of innateness, which is why Daniel Lehrman had a lot to say about the opposite point of view, the importance of experience in behavior. I mean, this is the whole nature-nurture issue in its more modern form. Nicholas Tinbergen. So he had his own theory of instinctive behavior. We're not really going to look at that theory. It didn't have much impact, actually. He did his own work primarily on the social behavior of gulls and wrote the very first textbook in animal behavior. It's called The Study of Instinct, published in 1951.
Nico Tinbergen was one of the first biologists to do rigorous studies of the behavior of animals in nature. To understand why it was so special, you have to understand the context. Most people that were studying animal behavior at the time were psychologists, and they were working with a limited number of species, pigeons, rats, and so forth, and they were doing them in the lab. Tinbergen was basically a naturalist, loved nature, wanted to work in nature. He showed all of us that even though the animals are in nature, you can still get high-quality data on them. High-quality data in terms of observing them carefully, documenting what they do, but also doing experiments. A lot of people will jump right into doing an experiment, very quickly coming up with hypotheses. Nico Tinbergen emphasized very importantly that taking time out at the initial stage to do a broad reconnaissance of what the animal is doing, a broad descriptive approach. And he put it so nicely, the watching and the wondering. Watching to see what animals really are doing in nature, and then wondering, figuring out, okay, well, what might be the hypotheses? What might be going on? Why is the animal doing that? Or how is the animal doing that? He would let his wonderment or his hypotheses grow out of his watching. And that's really how discoveries get made. It's usually when you discover something when you're looking over here, but then unexpectedly you see something interesting going on over there.
Tinbergen's among my favorite ethologists. I mean, his approach is perfect. I mean, first you start out with observation and description, as Tom Seeley just indicated, and then you proceed to do experimental manipulations, and he did them in the field. He did some laboratory work, but most of his important contributions come from his field experiments. So very different from Lorenz. Instead of just casual observations and things like that, he did some very elegant field experiments, and we'll be looking at some of these throughout the course. And finally, Karl von Frisch, who studied bee orientation. And he discovered the waggle dance, which is how bees communicate the source of food to other bees. So you'll have a foraging bee go out, find food, come back to the hive, and by this waggle dance, and it's that bee right there in the middle, well, kind of in the middle. It's that guy. Try to follow him with my cursor. That guy right there. And you can see the other bees paying attention to him. He just flew off. That bee is communicating, the one that's doing the waggle dance is communicating the distance, the relative distance of the food from the hive, and also the direction that the other bees should fly when they leave the hive to find the source of food. And when we talk about communication, I'll show you how to actually read the waggle dance. So that's about it for some important 20th century ethologists and comparative psychologists.